to introduce Irwin, talking about the First Amendment and the marketplace of ideas.
Thank you for letting me talk about philosophy. I've helped shut down, I think last weekend brought me up to 17 KKK rallies and Nazi rallies. I've helped shut them down in Newport, Morristown, Dunlap, 3 in Knoxville, all over. So I'm very logistically oriented, and I never get to talk about philosophy. If you want radicals to form a circular firing squad, bring up philosophy. Often I try to stick to logistics, so it's kind of a pleasure for me to actually get a chance to talk about history and philosophy just a bit. First, a joke. What does non-confrontation of evil as a successful tactic and unicorns have in common? They're both mythological beings. Non-confrontation with the Ku Klux Klan is a proven failed tactic. It has always failed. You know, just all the way back to Nazi Germany, you can look at it failing. You can look at it in Pulaski. You can read their forums. They love when they're not confronted. They write about it. They get their talking points out. The new KKK is anti-NAFTA. You may not know this, they're pro-environment as well. They also support steelworkers. But it's when you start challenging them, they start screaming about, my favorite quote was, when my ex-wife said to one of them, you know, Jesus was a Jew and probably black. This is in Newport. And he began screaming, Jesus was not a blue Jew. He had blue eyes and blonde hair and was related to Queen Victoria. And you can go to Westminster Abbey and see for yourself. And even the other KKK members are backing up like, somebody tell Bubba to shut the hell up. He's making us look crazy. But that's the point, is all it takes is a little poking, a little prodding, and then the truth about rounding you all mud people up and putting you in camps comes out. Non-confrontation, they love it. They write about it on their forums. You can read about it. It makes them feel like John Wayne to come into town and the terrified citizenry is hiding off in the corners. And then they get to make their YouTube videos with no visible signs of opposition. They get to talk to the media with no audio sounds of opposition. But, and that's what happened just now in Memphis, where we had over 1,200 people show up. To my knowledge, one of the largest civil rights gatherings in Tennessee history. And who heard about it in national news? Nobody. It was almost media blackout silence. And what they did was they gave the KKK in Memphis, the city officials, the clearest invitation they could. Y'all, please come back. Because they kept all of us away from them, so we could not debate with them, so we could not argue with them, so we could not challenge their ideas. But I'll come back to that in a second. One of the ways that progressives and liberals justify leaving the KKK alone is this flawed understanding of this thing called the First Amendment, which you could also call the right to argue ideas in public. They argue that the First Amendment is the right of some idiot to go up and babble, unopposed, whatever insanity they want. But it's not just that. It's debate. It's this concept of the marketplace of ideas. When I was asked to come here and speak, I was reading an essay by Aristotle on the Athenian Constitution. For some reason, when I was asked what I wanted to speak about, I was like, Aristotle. So I'll do that. Aristotle wrote about this concept we call democracy came primarily from Athens during a period of revolutions. And what he said was, at the beginning, you had 2 classes in Athens. You had the haves and the have-nots. The haves we call the oligarchs. You had no rights, not even basic human rights as a have-not. You could not own property. Your life could be taken from you at any time. You had no right. And the people rebelled. And they demanded basic human rights. And they got them. And then what happened? The oligarchs, the powerful, the wealthy, began subverting these new democratic institutions. And the people had to rebel again. And this time they took the football even further and said, no, we want even more rights this time. And they won and they got them. Then it happened a third time. The third time's where things got interesting. This guy named Solon instituted what I call the Fight Club of democracy. Solon said that when people rose up in armed conflict for the control of Athens, that you had to pick a side. Doesn't matter, winning or losing, you had to pick a side or you lost your citizenship. Then the oligarchs, the wealthy, began subverting these basic human rights, and the people rebelled again and demanded even more. There was a series of 12 of these revolutions that happened. And it was in this the concept that we call democracy evolved. According to Aristotle, who, by the way, was no fan of the concept of democracy. He viewed it as the 3rd lowest form of government. But it was like a kid being forced to write an essay about something you don't really like anymore. And he's a good writer, too. And one of the things that comes up in this is that democracy is a product of class warfare. Indeed, Aristotle would say you can't even talk about democracy historically outside of the conflict context of class warfare. And when I hear the right on hate radio going, they're talking about class warfare, that betrays an utter historical ignorance as to the very foundations and roots of democracy. Another interesting question that pops up is, if this cycle is what happens, and by the way, the same thing happened in France, but eventually the French just got tired of it and began decapitating people when they got caught up in that cycle. But if this is the historical cycle of people demanding more rights and then the oligarchs, the powerful, or as we may term them, the 1%, beginning to subvert those basic democratic institutions, where are we now? Where can we identify ourselves now in this classical pattern of democracy? I think you all know the answer to that. Some things that make the question is a little more complex is, what about in a society where we dump tons of pharmaceuticals on people to make them passive and happy? How does that affect the cycle? And other thing that comes out when you look at this cycle is the First Amendment. How was it used? The right to argue ideas in public. Well, it was one of the most powerful rights they had. In fact, ironically, one of the most powerful groups in Athens during this time was satire, the humorists, the people that mocked people. And it was viewed as, so that brings us, I want to bring us forward from Aristotle and from what happened in this evolution of democracy, which is people rule, rule of the people, direct democracy, not this representative stuff that we have in our country right now. Our Jefferson, Franklin, the rest, they were classically educated. The First Amendment came out of that context. The idea that the Supreme Court has said the clearest interpretation of why we have a Second Amendment is to protect ourselves from our government when, not if, when it becomes tyrannical. I would argue the First Amendment is for even more so. First they take your tongue, then they come for your weapons. That's one of the things that I don't hear in this debate about guns right now, is in that category. That's why it's there. That's why we have a First Amendment right. Jefferson is actually the one that coined the term marketplace of ideas. The Supreme Court has said the reason we have a First Amendment right is so we can argue ideas in public together and then let the public decide what the best ideas are. It is a dangerous weapon. It is a dangerous tool. And that's what I wanted to bring up in the context of these Klan rallies and the Nazi rallies and confronting them and the mistake that Memphis made. Because separating us so we cannot debate is completely against the context of the First Amendment. And when neoliberals and progressives start saying, no, you're interfering with their First Amendment rights, going to debate them and going to argue them, it shows our educational system has failed. We have not taught people what it actually means when you can actually believe that's true. So, let me check my notes real quick, make sure I'm staying on course here. Okay, so I talked about history and philosophy, confrontation. I want to get into my favorite part, logistics. I've helped, the first rally that I did not help shut down happened in Asheville, North Carolina. When the Ku Klux Klan tried to march through Asheville, and I thought to myself, I'm a little embarrassed at this time, I don't want to give them energy. The liberals are telling me I'm giving them energy if I turn up. Is that true? Should I go? Should I not go? During this time, you may not know it, but Asheville actually does have an African American population. They are just so economically segregated, you can live in that town and never know it. But they do ride the buses in the morning. And I used to go to AB Tech and I would be on the buses with them. And this huge rally happened and like 3,000 people showed up and I got to see the video. My friends helped organize it. One of my favorite parts is when the Grand Dragon's walking through the middle and this little old woman, she's like 60, goes, I know him! I know you! You hit on me every single day at the 7-Eleven! And he's like, ah! And one of the problems that happens with the Ku Klux Klan and the Nazis is everybody has this black and white 1950s footage of them walking through town and the terrified citizenry sitting on the side, scared. And I think that was what the programming was for the people when I rode on the bus to AB Tech. And then all of a sudden, 3,000 people turn out and mock and ridicule them every step that they make through Asheville. And then I get on the bus next day, and I didn't go. And what did I see? I saw a community whose very perception of itself changed overnight. Suddenly they went in a 24-hour period from living in a town that had that 50s grainy black and white footage in their head into a town where 3,000 people would show up and say, not in our town. Get the hell out of here. You do not belong here. You're historically ignorant thinking you have any place in Appalachia. I saw how just that, and to me it struck me as pure magic. To see how it could shape a community's perception of itself. And I made a note. I'm going to do that next time. Our next rally was in Newport. It was the Knights of the White Camellia who were in northern Alabama. They decided for some stupid reason that Appalachia was where they're going to do a resurgence of their activity. So I'm a tree hugger, and the rest of my tree hugger friends got together, and we were like, well, we're organizers. They're trying to have a public rally. How would we sabotage our own rallies? It was actually an interesting exercise that made me better at organizing other demonstrations. We realized, well, A, recruitment. They're organizers. They're trying to recruit people. So we'll bring flyers to give people information about what they're up to. Also, by the way, we noticed that their recruiters come in brand new shiny SUVs and new vehicles, but the people they're recruiting from are in old pickup trucks and wearing camouflage. Coincidentally, many of us tree huggers wore camouflage in old pickup trucks, and that they would come to us and start talking to us and say, do you want our information? We'd be like, yeah, sure, give it to us, before they realized that we were not on their side. Also, we realized interviews. We don't want them to get a single interview across without hearing visible opposition to their message. They can't get a YouTube video in. They can't talk to a reporter without hearing us chanting in the background. Signs. We didn't want them to get a single photograph in of these people without visible signs of resistance everywhere. So we recruited from their base. We attacked them in terms of an auditory, and it worked. We found out something amazing. They excel at violence. They suck at arguing ideas in public. And all it takes is a little bit of nudging to knock them off their message. And all of a sudden, Nazi with the Bible. The first thing they always do is bring out the Bible. And we start chanting, Nazi with the Bible, Nazi with the Bible. And they get outraged and they start saying crazy stuff. And then that's what makes the nightly news. And also we discovered there's always media that shows up. The progressives and liberals have this grand Wizard of Oz dream. What if the media never showed up? That doesn't matter. They always show up. They're there in mass. Just by showing up and raising your hand and saying, I disagree, we would steal half their media. We would get coverage in Idaho, everywhere. It's just like free media laying there. I'd never seen anything like the sheer amount of media we could hijack at theirs just by showing up. We also found that they're like Operation Rescue has a similar problem in that their fringe element, their craziest people define who and what they are. It's exactly the same with the KKK. And what we found was that invariably we shut down the Newport rally and they were humiliated. They didn't want to come back. They did not respond well to being challenged. We organized one in Morristown. The same thing happened. They talk about it on their listservs and we would read it. And what we found was confrontation worked again and again and again. And then we began getting creative because they began expecting us. And law enforcement, lo and behold, the state troopers and stuff, we began getting successful at convincing them that if we didn't confront them, they were going to come back. And one of my strangest, most surreal experiences as kind of an anarchist was going to Morristown, and I'm the first one there, and 3 state troopers, 2 of them African American, coming up going, Chris, great, you're here. Are y'all bringing the drums? And I'm like, well, yeah, we're bringing drums and signs. Are they coming? And I'm like, well, yeah. And they're like, great, great. And they're looking at each other and they go. And one of the things that you run into this, though, in organizing against anti-KKK stuff is you do get what I call the Hulk smash macho posturing radicals. They want to be radicals so bad that they just want to talk about violence and smash and anything you say. But the reality is there's so many police at these events, if you raise your hand, bang, you're off the streets. In terms of an actual logistical tactic that you can use at these rallies, violence isn't going to work. You're not going to last long. Fortunately, there's a bunch of other tactics that work quite well. So we began getting creative. They began anticipating what we were doing, and a friend of mine came up one day and said, Chris, what if we all dressed in clowns and act like we were just completely misunderstanding what this was all about and tried to join them as clowns? And we had Mountain Justice there as well, so we had like 200 activists to organize on that. And I was like, go for it. Not my gig, go for it though. Try your tactic. And what they did was they all showed up. We had like 50, 60 people showed up as clowns. They actually tried to join the Pointy Head Rally, which was hilarious. And then when the Nazis start yelling, white power, my clown friends would go, tight shower? And they'd all get together under a solar shower and go, tight shower, tight shower. Then the clown would get angry and go, white power! And the clowns would look at each other and go, wife power? And they'd pick up the female clowns and start chanting, wife power, wife power, wife power. And they would erupt and they would lose it. I mean, my point is you can be so creative. There's so many ways to make them, just ridicule them and take them apart at a rally. The next rally, we knew they were going to expect clowns, so we got a big sound system. And we played, let's see, African American love soul ballads like Isaac Hayes. So you can hear in their videotape of their speech, you hear, they're trying to get their hate on, and all of a sudden you hear, doom, 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 doom. Yeah, baby. And then we played MLK speeches. Every time they would get angry, start yelling something, I'd go, dance request! And we put on Ricky Martin, and they'd be talking about the white race, and they'd hear, dun, 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 and everybody would mobilize. And in fact, I got one Nazi so angry that he began crying on stage. He had the microphone, and he was like, I had to work to get this sound system, which was a small one, and I'm going to start following your rallies around, and the big skin I had Nazi had to take the thing from him and be like, yeah, brother, yeah, hell yeah, to charge him. And at first I felt bad. I was like, I made that guy cry. Then I felt good. I was like, I made a Nazi cry. And so we did this again and again and again, and every time we could read on their listservs, they hated to get humiliated. But one thing that did happen to let you know that this is not just laughs, is in Dunlap when we did the same thing, and they didn't last long. Also, Phelps lasted 30 minutes under heckling. At Gay Day in Dollywood, he promised 2 hours. He couldn't handle 30 minutes of heckling before he left. We took his spot, and then everybody coming out of Dollywood joined us. That was an amazing experience. But my point is that, yeah, it works. Confrontation works. Non-confrontation doesn't. But in Dunlap, what happened was, while we were rallying them, an ATF agent went up to 2 KKK members and said, I hate immigrants. I would like to learn how to make pipe bombs and learn how to kill them. And guess what the KKK members did? They went, great! Yeah, we'll teach you. And they held a pipe bomb making workshop for an ATF agent for the express purposes of killing immigrants. Needless to say, 2 of them got busted. The internal security for the KKK is called Nighthawks. Their Nighthawks went out and managed to freak out and make paranoid their entire movement and pretty much stop that organizing effort. The trick is with the KKK is that historically they're on a boom and bust cycle, and it's often tied to the economy. And that's one of the things that we have to look at. And what's happening with this conference right now is I can tell you exactly, they have exact same conference in Gatlinburg. And what they're talking about now is they know they got to get rid of the swastikas. They really don't like the men with the pointy hats. They need to start talking about NAFTA and GATT. They're trying to start, pardon the pun, whitewashing their image. The problem with that is that when people show up, the truth comes out. The First Amendment works. That debate, in the argument, the truth comes out and the people get to decide. And that's why it's such a deadly tool, dangerous tool. Let me talk about violence really quickly. Another thing the neoliberals do is say, well, we can't let you argue, there might be violence. There was violence in Athens. You had to take firearms. People in the civil rights, they didn't have firearms, you had to fight. People in the civil rights movement were firebombed. Churches were burned. If it's fear of violence that keeps you from confronting evil, evil will always win because evil by definition embraces violence. It's only through confrontation that the truth comes out. That cannot be an excuse for inaction, which is too often what the liberals want. Pardon, my French when I say liberals, I mean no insult by that. I've known perfectly good liberals. I've had some friends that were liberals. As an anarchist, it's just reasonable minds can differ. So that gives you the context of the previous rallies. Let's talk about what happened in Memphis. Well, one thing that happened was there were 30 police officers in a line keeping me from arguing with them. And I had them for 2 hours, a captive audience. They got to listen to me lecture them about Aristotle for about 2.5 hours. I was surprised none of them tried to eat their gun at the end. They were getting really uncomfortable because they knew I was right. They knew, and one of the things I said was the First Amendment must be a dangerous creature to be hidden behind a cage like this, to be kept captive like an animal, where citizens of Memphis must be kept away, so far away. And what did the KKK get with the city of Memphis' assistance? Well, you can tell, because Channel 3 interviewed them afterwards, and they came out and they said, this was awesome. This was one of our best rallies. They were so generous to us. They were so professional. They walked us right through the middle. They got to make their YouTube videos. They got to do their promotional materials. They got to stay on message. They got to cause the city of Memphis to spend over $100,000 to put 600 cops on the street to keep 1,200 people from daring to argue and debate them with their hate-filled racist ideology. They got the clearest invitation they possibly could get. Y'all come back. I would come back. As an organizer, probably any of you all would come back. If you could get international media, cause the city to spend 100,000 people, not get argued with, stay on your talking points, why wouldn't you? You would be a fool not to come back. And that's how it's going to bite the city of Memphis, because they're going to get it again. They're coming back. Where on the other hand, they're not coming back to Knoxville. We kind of almost wish they would. It's rare in life where ignorance, racism, hatred, and stupidity not only goes up in public and raises its hand, but goes ahead and puts on a pointy hat for you and a robe for you to attack. Normally racism and all the isms are more subtle than that. It's almost a public service. You can cause a community through this confrontation to change its very perspective of itself. That also brings up a point, sometimes they use Martin Luther King as an example of like, well, non-confrontation, which is a complete misunderstanding of what Mr. King wrote about, which often was this idea of creative tension. That without the creative tension that arises from that conflict, from that confrontation, no change never happens. When people are all relaxed, there's not, change doesn't happen. There's no creative tension. And that's the second damage that happened. And it was wrong. Now, I've heard talk today, we're talking about the Fourth Amendment because of drugs. And I'm a criminal defense attorney. I'm well aware of that. It's true. And the erosion of our constitutional liberties across the board. But what we have to ask ourselves is, given this historical cycle that I've explained through Aristotle, are we surprised? Are we surprised? And whose responsibility is it to revolt, to fight back, to retake the football even further in terms of democracy? What more could we do? Athens actually had what was called a radical democracy. One thing that they did was every politician, the more powerful your role was, the less time you were in office. If he was really powerful, they had some offices that you were in power for 2 days. Plus, you had 2 citizens that watched you, and if you were corrupt or stepped over the border, you lost your citizenship. Indeed, sometimes your life. Also, how they used, which would be interesting in our current political system. Also, what they used was juries. Paneled citizens. We don't use our juries anything like they're supposed to be in a democracy. And again, we don't live in a democracy. We just live in a republic that was infused with democratic ideals, which is something else that could change and should. But juries, if Athens wanted to go to war, it had to go through a jury of citizens. If they wanted to build a building, the government wanted to do that, it had to go through a jury of citizens. There are so many examples of democratic ideals that we don't use today that we should be embracing. I could actually, as you all have guessed, talk for another 3 or 4 hours, but I did want to give a chance for some questions. I'll keep talking.
You have about 25 minutes.
I had 25 minutes to talk about philosophy. Excellent. Well, actually, does anybody have any questions at this point before I go on? All right, I see a hand in the back.
I just want to know if you have delved into the politics of Genghis Khan.
Genghis Khan?
Yes.
Yeah, I've read about Genghis Khan.
I was wondering if you delved into that to see anything that could come from there forward to assist us now from this perspective of politics.
Well, Genghis Khan actually was trying to just get rid of the people to have pasture land. He had he actually passed a policy. He was so outraged that people were faking death in cities to avoid being killed that he passed a policy to decapitate everybody just to make sure they got rid of everybody. He was just flat out creating pasture land. As far as his organizational structures, here's an interesting historical note. Do you all know about the orcs in The Hobbit? That was actually a squadron in Genghis Khan's army. That's where the word orc comes from.
And your history sounds pretty new.
Gibbon.
Genghis Khan.
I don't know, I've read some of his biographies, and then Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire writes about Genghis Khan as well.
Yeah, that's really new history. But anyway, I'm just wondering.
Okay.
Just wondering.
Go ahead.
Concerning the subtlety that you said that our opposition sometimes shows, in particular the fact that they're saying we have to get rid of NAFTA. A lot of us feel we have to get rid of NAFTA.
Yes.
So I don't see quite how we deal with, how we confront them when they say we have to get rid of NAFTA and we agree. What do we do there?
You go, the Klan is wearing dresses! The Klan is wearing dresses! But that's okay. The Klan is good. That was a contribution of some of the gay and lesbian community at one of our rallies. We started chanting, the Klan is wearing dresses, and then they were going, but that's okay. And all of a sudden, they're not talking about NAFTA anymore. They actually called me a Taliban Jew when we did that, which is a little confusing, because I was like, wait a second, the Taliban's recruiting Jews? That goes against everything I know. Apparently, they didn't like my hat. So really, it's just, you don't really have to argue one-on-one with their points. It's like, well, actually, I don't see how race plays a role in NAFTA and stuff. But if you just push them a little bit, they'll blow past this new pretty rhetoric they're trying to put over their bedrock of racism. Sir?
To your point, sir. What I would say, because when we go up there, they're going to come out and they're going to want to talk to us. And one of the things that they're going to try to appeal to us is on that common ground kind of thing. And if anybody here is a libertarian, I apologize, but I have no use for them because they're the ones that are really, really good at doing that. And the one thing that I would just simply say is that there are some deal breakers that keep us from uniting on whatever issue we may otherwise agree on. And if you can't break away from those, then we can't work with you. We'll work with people that we feel comfortable with. That's the attitude. They can talk about how much they hate NAFTA all they want. I hate NAFTA too. But I hate NAFTA with respectable people.
And in the discussions for the lead up for the last Memphis rally, you saw that. The communists mad at the anarchists because they were saying about blah blah. They're mad at me because I'm talking about the First Amendment, and the more radical than that, I was like, I use the Constitution for toilet paper. And what we found was, when you talk about logistics, that doesn't happen so much. But what I realized was when I was in the crowd in front of the police line with communists, socialists, people I don't normally agree with on certain issues, they were there. That's just icing on the cake. They were there. They were standing there, standing for their rights, against the First Amendment. Also, another argument that I sometimes get to counter is, why aren't you allowing the African American community take the lead in this? Why don't they take the role in deciding you're stepping over their authority when you're getting involved in this? And what I respond is, there's no brothers and sisters under those hoods. They're saying that they're there to protect white people. They are white people. They are the white community's responsibility. Expecting the very target communities to go, that put their heads out and say, okay, we want you up front because you're the ones they say they want to kill and hunt. Though I'm the ones they're saying that they're there to defend. I think that's thinking about the problem backwards. That it's our responsibility, all of our responsibility to cover that. Also, on a quick note on race, according to Gibbon, this whole idea, if you'd gone to a citizen of the Roman Empire and started talking about race, they would have thought you were insane. They enslaved egalitarian. But Gibbon wrote of Italians, nobility fighting and killing each other in duels for the privilege of dating and going out with African nobility. It seems like the concept of race as we use it developed was during the British colonialization of Africa, the process of paternalization, of dehumanizing the victim. And it's from there that you start seeing it being used. It's relatively a new concept in terms of existence of as our people. And so I saw another hand. Sir.
I just want, on that note, urge everybody after this is over, please go demonstrate in front of the hotel with us. I don't know if everyone's planning on doing that, but there were 5 of us out yesterday. Okay, there were 5 of us, and there were hundreds of fascists. And we got like 2/3 as much airtime as they did.
Bang! There you go.
So,
yep. And
I mean,
when I took out Phelps, there were 2 of us. None of my friends were mobilizing, and I had this friend, and she was like, "Yeah, I'll go." She was a lesbian, and she hated him for that basis. 2 of us went and mocked about 30 of them, and they could not handle it. It made them so angry that they wrapped up their signs and left. And then we went and we took their spot and their media, and all these people that had gone in seeing the swastika by Phelps came out and saw like people holding signs with Hitler blowing his brains out saying, "Follow your leader," and "I love my interracial relationship," because we had lots of signs, and joined us. So you're exactly right. 3 people can take apart one of their rallies. 10 people can take apart and take their media from them, everything. It's just about numbers and getting across fear. Because we're all, people are afraid. These people are killers. They're murderers. They strike in the night. But where they don't strike is in broad daylight. And when we come out, it confuses them. When they see the people that they're arguing they're there to defend, they get angry and they get confused. And it's a lot of fun. I gotta do that as well. It's a lot of fun. Like I said, it's rare when ignorance and stupidity dresses funny, goes out in public and raises its hand. It's almost a community service that they do in a lot of these communities. And what we found was in every community where we did this, it changed people's perspectives of where they lived overnight, especially Knoxville, where I'm from and where I was born. Overnight, you saw people thinking the Andy Griffith black and white grainy footage of them walking through the middle of town was gone. All of a sudden, it was clowns and people laughing at them and Isaac Hayes playing in the background. And also, when they left at the last one, I got Chef's song, Suck on My Chocolate Salty, and we played that at the top of the volume as well. So we reprogrammed people's perspective of where they lived. It's more than just confronting them. It's a tool to change people's perspective of the communities they live and what they can do. And now what I like to think is 30 years from now when they're playing movies of this region, they're not going to be able to play just the black and white grainy footage anymore. When they do that kind of footage, what they're going to see is people mobilizing. And one of the most dangerous tools we have is the spirit of the First Amendment, the right to argue ideas in public. They're great at violence. They suck at that. Did I see another hand in the back, sir?
So, I agree with a lot of what you're saying. What I don't understand is why it is that anarchists use this terminology of the marketplace of ideas, or this reference to capitalism.
Good question.
This idea that the free market, or the invisible hand of the free market, will sort out the correct ideas. Usually I wouldn't press like a liberal on that point, but as somebody who calls himself an anarchist,
Yep.
why use metaphors that are like pro-capitalist rhetoric to make points?
Part of it's convenience. That's what the Supreme Court said. You know, and I hear the argument, and it was the argument as well with the First Amendment. People were like, well, that's just part of the whole, system, and it was passed by blah, 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 blah. But the thing is, if you're trying to change people's ideas, I mean, too many people I saw were just attacking people who had this misperception of the First Amendment. And was just like, Hulk smash, you suck, blah, 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 blah. But I think it's more powerful when you can say, look, I may not agree with the context, but you're historically wrong. Even in your own context, what you're arguing is wrong. And I don't see it so much as, that's a positivist view, is what it's called, of the First Amendment. I see it more in terms of a democratic ideal. And just some biographical information about myself. I spent my 20s as a mobile activist. I was at a place called Warner Creek. I was at the Redwoods. I worked with Keith McHenry with Food Not Bombs in San Francisco. And in my 20s, anarchists at the time were basically, the First Amendment, the Constitution was passed by evil, slaveholding, wealthy, property-owning bastards. You shouldn't listen to any of them. And I bought that. I said it. I argued it. I was like, yeah, I'm not going to listen to any of these people. But then I thought of Thomas Paine, who never owned any slaves. And in fact, Peter Kropotkin, the man who coined the term anarchist, wrote that during the French Revolution, there were 3 people that stayed true to the ideals of the revolution throughout it. One of them was Peter Kropotkin. What I found is that, when I look deep into the intent of democratic ideals of distrust of large government, the idea of decentralization, distrust of corporations, I see a lot of that radiated back all the way down to Athens. And some of that percolated through the First Amendment. And I'm an opportunist. I will use, in terms of politically, what I find laying around. And what I found was, in that context, a distrust of the government. I mean, when you have the Supreme Court saying we have guns to overthrow the government when it becomes tyrannical, that was different from the narrative that I had, believed up to that point. So, yeah, and the marketplace of ideas, actually, to me, that's too limited. I don't really subscribe to that. That's just what the Supreme Court has said, tracking Jefferson. I go before that to this idea that it's our ability to just argue in public. I also think the Constitution it has some democratic ideals in it, but it's kind of a flawed document. They screwed it up. The Bill of Rights is more reflective of those Athenian ideals of democracy, which you can call anarchist. It was direct representative of democracy. So that's my lawyerly 2-minute answer to your question. We're all conflicted human beings. I am as well. My philosophy isn't perfect. I'm not perfect. I'm just figuring out a lot of this as I go along. And I don't like even calling it the First Amendment. It's just a human right. It's a human right that we instilled. And what we're saying is, past this border, the government has no business being here. This is not yours. This is the line that you cross, and we determine where that line is. I could use different terminology, but that's what's convenient right now. You can also probably want to ask me what I'm doing as a lawyer. Since
What are you doing as a lawyer?
I knew that was coming up. My job, the lawyer is, the legal profession is one of the few professions that still openly welcomes pirates. My job is to take as much money from corporations as possible and to keep people out of jail. I'm okay with that philosophically. I've had other work, but in terms of tools for me to attack corporations and understanding what's going on in the system, I tried living without working. It didn't work out. And I was arrested for civil disobedience, I think 17 times. So I was in court all the time. And I was like, I think I could do that. Just watching other attorneys argue, and I was like, I could get paid to do that. And then I could take money from corporations. And I also saw how much my opposition was terrified of men in suits. By the way, all my suits come from Goodwill. I get them at half off at the end of the month. But nobody can tell. I can go up against an attorney in an $800 suit. He doesn't know once we start arguing. In fact, he doesn't care really soon if he starts judging me by my appearance. And on the subject of appearance, one of the things I've learned since I've made my transition is dumb people judge you by your appearance, so do smart people. I go into Panera's in the morning, and I'm going to have my Goodwill suit on, and they're, yes, sir, no, sir, right away, sir, here you go, sir, that one's free. And I come in my normal post-apocalyptic gardening clothes that afternoon, and they're like, 3 people, we'll get to you when we get to you. It's a tool. And I use whatever tool I can lay my hands on because I like to win. And, clothing, rhetoric, I'll use what I can. Go ahead.
So, I think, you said you're familiar with philosophy. Are you familiar with Foucault, for example, right?
Nope, don't know what you're talking about.
Foucault? Okay, so, who he is isn't exactly relevant to my point, but Foucault, this philosopher, wrote these lectures that I can't...
I know who Foucault is now. Okay,
Yeah.
my brain kicked in.
Yeah, and he wrote these lectures, and I can't remember the name to them right now, but he traced Athenian democracy up to the contemporary and talk about what the Athenians had to say about the individual who was the person that would always speak out, and this kind of idea of...
like Socrates, they executed him.
Right, exactly, and he goes into that as well. And,
Yeah.
And so eventually he comes to, and he said, his whole thing is that ultimately a lack of discourse is what is a big problem in society. And that's, this goes into psychiatry, for example, and the prisons and everything else. And ultimately he says that where does democracy exist in the contemporary? And he says that it doesn't exist in these places where people are confronting each other at protests, but they exist in the revolutionary cell, that people going out doing revolutionary activity, for example, in the 70s and the 80s and things like that, was the only time that democracy actually exists.
Well,
so would you say that?
Well, let's look at this concept we call democracy or egalitarian relationships. When we get people to meet at our little meetings for an hour a week, look at their background. Who really has experience in egalitarian relationships? We come from schools that aren't egalitarian. Nobody votes for their classes. Families aren't egalitarian or democratic. Usually it's dad down to the dog. Your workplaces aren't democratic. That's, it's you do what you're told to do or you're fired. What we do is we get people that have no real experience in egalitarian relationships, and we put them together for an hour or two a week, and we say, now be egalitarian, y'all. Now it works. And they fight, and they argue, and they bicker. But it works. Eventually people will start working together. And I think Peter Kropotkin kind of answered this. How much time do I have?
10 minutes.
Okay, I can do this. Okay, Peter Kropotkin existed in a time of when Darwin's theory of competition between the species was in effect. And what the social Darwinists were saying, well, if that's the rule of nature, 8-year-olds working in coal mines is okay because that's the natural model. Peter Kropotkin was a science geek that got assigned to the steppes of Russia to do what's called a taxonomic inventory. He was counting plants. He was a good scientist, though, and he's thinking about Darwin's theory. By the way, Darwin also wrote about cooperation, but people just focused on the competition. And he's thinking about this, and what he's seeing, though, is, yeah, there's some competition there, but I'm seeing much more cooperation in nature. Lichen, which is a symbiotic relationship. And then he put word out to scientists all over the world and wrote this opus called Mutual Aid, which is just filled with scientific examples of people, of animals and everything cooperating. And that made him a good natural scientist. What made him a good social scientist is he did what the social Darwinists did and said, well, if cooperation is more the rule in nature, why is it more the rule among humans? His idea was it's because there's a system doing what KRS-One calls miseducating us out of our natural cooperative impulses. And that's where he came to this idea of anarchy, that there's a reason. And I think that later Jane Goodall and primate studies bear that out. Just as primates, we should be better at cooperating with one another. It's just our history. And I think that if we weren't naturally cooperative by nature, and coming out of that background I'm talking about families that aren't democratic, schools that aren't democratic, workplaces that are democratic, trying to come together once a week would never work. We would never cooperate. And I think the reason we do is because there's a biological impulse. We are naturally cooperative just as primates. And that's why it can happen. You can do it we've all seen it that have organized, in a year when the community starts gelling and people stop bickering and they start working together when things get at their best. And I think that if cooperation wasn't such the natural order, that would never happen. Which I probably didn't answer your question at all, but I got to philosophize.
But on the Kropotkin point real quick, like where he was studying in particular, there wasn't a scarcity. And so he was coming to completely different conclusions than the naturalists were in England, for example. And what I want to say is that I don't think that we should go from this idea of it's just human nature that compatibility happens, but that we have to create that for ourselves and create that
You're
human
right.
nature.
You're right. We have to do, if KRS-One calls it miseducation, we have to do re-education. And I think that's what we're doing right now, is through an exchange of ideas. Some of my ideas may be great, some of them may suck. But through this debate and discourse we're developing, among ourselves. And Miss Manners says, here I go quoting Miss Manners, that there's too much communication in our society and not enough conversation. And what she means by that is any of the conversations we'll have today in minutes. I'm probably going to know your favorite movie, what you like to eat, where you live, all this information. She says that's not conversation. Conversation is when people come with these essential elements, but they build something more than the sum of its parts. That's what conversation is. It's more than just exchanging information. It's building together something bigger with that information. And I think that's part of the key towards breaking through this miseducation, is that through the communication and the dialogue, and I think what we're doing here right now would be recognizable to any Athenian right now as part of the key process of building a democratic and egalitarian process. Go ahead.
What's KRS-One?
KRS-One, knowledge reigns supreme to, and he is a hip-hop artist. He's part of conscious hip-hop, Paris, KRS-One, the Goats, the Coup, Zion I, Public Enemy. They're all part of this conscious, not quite gangster hip-hop. And I could talk about gangster hip-hop versus conscious hip-hop.
Knowledge reigns supreme over nearly everyone.
Yeah, exactly. He was actually a former Krishna, wasn't he?
No, his name is Krishna.
Okay, I thought he had some...
But,
Yeah.
but
Go ahead, sir.
yeah, no, go on.
All right. Questions? How much time do we have?
7 minutes.
7 whole minutes. I can talk about... Go ahead. Anything at all? Any suggestions? Well, I guess if you take nothing else from this today is, again, to bring it back what I opened with, non-confrontation is a historical, categorical failure. It has never worked. And when you do hear if you hear, people when a Klan rally or a KK rally is happening saying, well, you're interfering with our First Amendment rights, you can destroy that argument. It's not that hard. And you can educate them about what democracy means. Also, another interesting note about the Athenian democracy, no lawyers. That part was crazy talk. I completely am against that part. They were also anti-professional as well. And one of the interesting critiques that happened is people look at it and say, well, only 35,000 people were actual citizens, and that was too small. At the time, what the other countries were saying is, that's way too much. It was cutting edge for its time. And ask yourself, too, where are we going to carry the democratic football further? How are we going to make our society more democratic when, not if, but when the next period of change happens, which is the history of democracy? If you pour beer down my throat, I'll talk about this stuff for like days. The 30 officers I had, I think, got a full 2 hours of my lecturing them. I swear they got uncomfortable. But a judge did hear it, and then later told the press that he thought it was wrong how they kept us separated, and it may have done damage to the First Amendment. So, well, I will be glad to finish early if nobody has any other questions. Sir?
I remember you talked about the satire.
Yeah.
If I'm not mistaken, it's actually actors and playwrights.
Correct.
And I was thinking of like other things that even more, some other plays like The Foreigner and stuff that also, that have also been used against, this, and would you know of any, see that ever? Not The Foreigner, but any plays like that?
Oh, well, what's it? Who did Incident in Vichy? That was a really good one about Nazism and humanity. There's a lot of, but it's just interesting that it stands out in all these historical accounts about like the people arising and organizing, that playwrights and art played such a powerful role in it all. I mean, Aristotle, he didn't write about that at all. It was other historians. To him, I guess he took it for granted. Art is powerful. People that can use it as a tool, and it walks hand in hand in the First Amendment. It's just interesting to see that pop out. But yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of books. I mean, books and plays that revolve around the human condition, and I could list some of them if you want.
I was just trying to get art.
Yeah, good, and it should be. It's powerful.
So usually these white supremacist groups are very factional. They're very splintered, and they have their fights. But conferences like this one in particular, seems to be drawing more diverse elements on the white supremacists. Right, I talked to one person who said that he didn't identify as white, he identified as Christian. That's Christian identity is a particularly American form of white supremacy. I was wondering if you would talk a little about that.
Just a little. It's the British Israelites. Christian identity comes out of the British Israelites from the 1800s.
4 minutes.
My mistake.
Yeah. Well, you're right about that factionalism, and that's one of the things that typically blows them apart. Like at one time, the KKK hated the Nazis because many of them in the 50s fought in World War II, and they were like offended. And that was one of the things that blew up that part of their boom cycle. Now they're quite comfortable with one another. If you want to go to forums to read what they're up to, there's Stormfront is basically a KKK forum with Nazi sympathies. VNN, on the other hand, is a Nazi forum with KKK sympathies. But the what?
The Finlanders, you mean?
No, VNN, Vanguard News Network.
Okay.
And then up in Memphis, those are old guard KKK who still hate the Nazis. And which was interesting when they started talking about NSM and the Nazis coming down to deal with them. I saw that was never going to happen.
They have a swastika on one of their flags.
Yeah,
it was like a part American flag,
yeah.
and then.
Yeah, there is a profound discomfort, and that's one of the reasons they can come apart in debate, because they don't want. They're trying to. They're doing the same conference in Gatlinburg. They're trying to unify their message, but they do splinter like that. And in fact, you get a lot of the serious Nazis that ridicule Christianity. They consider Christianity as a Jew-based religion of all things. I don't know where they got the idea. But, and those fracture points come apart when you start challenging them at their rallies, because they don't always agree with one another. And if they are undebated, then what happens is they can keep their oatmeal bland message. It doesn't cause those fracture points. But when they get angry, that's when they start looking at each other and going, "What the hell did you just say?" And they start infighting. And that's a tool you can use against them. So that's a good point. Others? Okay, am I out of time?
Oh, you have 2 minutes.
I have
But if
2
y'all had a
entire
question for
All right.
previous
Well, I can use my next 2 minutes. First of all, thank you. I never get to talk about philosophy and history. I'm always about pure logistics. This has been a pleasure. I always like talking about this stuff. And the second, you're exactly right. If you want to do anything to show that any of this was of value, go out, get a sign, stand up there, heckle them, show the public that they do not represent Tennessee or North America. That's the clearest thing you could do from what I said today, if you heard me. Get out there, and I'll join you. I was actually thinking about going to their thing and trying to debate them, but this isn't my deal, so I'm going to do whatever you do.
Do it.
I hope I didn't get it all.
Everybody